complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Adam, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing good, man. Thanks for having me. I'm a longtime fan, so this is very cool.
Oh, good. I didn't even realize that. I was talking to you backstage, and you just kind of approached me out of the blue, and I was very pleasantly surprised, you know, to talk with you a little bit and to read your book, because I'll be honest, if you've been on the internet long enough, you develop a sort of skepticism of people who approach you out of the blue. You know, there's a lot of schizos out there, and you do good work, man. So I'm happy to have you on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate it.
So, because this is one of your first couple of appearances, I know you were on the Talkies Mag show, but could you kind of describe for the audience, you know, who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Adem Luz Rienspects. I like to emphasize the R in that for my European heritage. And I'm the author of MIXTAPE HYPERBOREA. That's pretty much all I have out right now is this novel, MIXTAPE HYPERBOREA. I've kind of emerged out of nowhere and gotten involved with, you know, some of the people in the, I would call it the alternative or dissident art scene. And we're all kind of getting to know each other and reading each other's work. And I'm just very optimistic about it. It seems like there's a lot of energy and kind of kinetic potential surrounding, you know, this burst in creativity that's happening totally outside the mainstream. So, yeah.
No, definitely. And I think that one of the things that we were kind of talking about is the kind of like the stultifying effect of modern culture, where it feels like you're sort of limited with what you can say, you know, at least kind of under your own name. And a big part of that, right, is that the people who create culture seem kind of uninterested of even, you know, putting a charade in front of their political messaging. And so you mentioned before that, you know, you don't consider yourself necessarily a political artist, which I am grateful for. But I'm curious, what's your perspective on kind of culture at large and how that affects the creative process?
Yeah, so I might ramble here a little bit, but my feeling is that art should essentially be a conversation between the artist and the person perceiving the art. So art should not be a lecture or being preached to by some authority, you know, and that's what I mean when I say that I don't consider myself like a right-wing artist in any way. And I think that what's happening right now is that in mainstream culture, you have a lot of art that has to conform to a bunch of these very specific rules about the message that it portrays. And the way I've always felt is when I understand a piece of art, like when I know exactly what it wants me to think, if essentially the artist has sat down and said, okay, I'm going to create this piece of art, and my goal is to push some kind of thesis statement, right, using examples that I've come up with, that whole relationship essentially feels manipulative to me. So what I think is I want to make stuff that's for smart people. And what that to me means is that I'm making art which portrays the real world and portrays things the way they are, and is not lecturing, but is kind of trying to create a dialogue with the person who's consuming it in a way that respects them, you know, and kind of respects their intelligence. And I think liberal art has completely tanked in that regard. Like I mentioned, you get the sense that you're like in a preschool classroom with a lot of it, you know, and you're being like literally told what to think as you consume it. And so that's how I feel. I'm not a right-wing artist, but for example, you know, my book, MIXTAPE HYPERBOREA, is about what it was like to be a youth, you know, a while ago in some ambiguous prior period where me and my friends would call each other gay and retarded and fight and, you know, do a lot of things that really can't be portrayed in any sense now, except as a cautionary tale against the, you know, dangers of male violence. And, you know, and it's just, there's no sense that those things can just be explored and presented and kind of left up to the viewer, you know, so that's kind of where I found myself.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is something that, you know, we aren't the first people to notice. And I think a lot of people in these spheres kind of end up down this rabbit hole first through media analysis, right? The joke is, well, Gamergate brought everyone here. And there's certainly a kernel of truth to that, that for a lot of people, the canary in the coal mine was popular media, right? And this
Right.
feeling that, wait a minute, like I can't enjoy something anymore. It's didactic. I'm being talked at instead of talked to. And it's something that is sort of refreshing, because like you said, it's like you wouldn't necessarily consider yourself a right-wing artist, but it's like by virtue of the fact that you are a conversational artist interested in something genuine and true, it's like you're almost by default, right wing in current era, I guess.
Right, which is I think fine. I think what I would be worried about is I see some people, and some of it to me is cynical. I do think we have to watch out for people who basically don't trust themselves enough as artists, and so they're trying to brand themselves as right-wing artists. Like, and they're writing some, like you can imagine some short story where, like they want to make some point about architecture, right? That like I agree with, that architecture has become very bland and sterile, and it used to be beautiful and ornate and inspired by the classics. And, they write some story about John was walking down the street and he witnessed the gentrified apartment complex, and it made his soul darken with its plastic, plexiglass panels. And it's like, all right, I really could get this from an article, or from a tweet. This doesn't need to be a story. A story, real art should be higher level than that. It shouldn't be, to me, that would be making the same mistake that the broader liberal artistic culture has made.
Yeah, and it's something that I guess is kind of interesting and encouraging in a way. You've mentioned this kind of scene of, dissident artists that you're a part of. And I think one of the really impoverishing things, the reason that I have a very tough time thinking of a novel or a work of art that I really love from the last half of the 20th century, going into the 21st century, is that kind of like slow strangulation of like dissidents and interesting ideas kind of happened, one by one. And I remember this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I know none of the details, but there was this screenshot going around from a prominent feminist author. It was her talking to her editor. And the two of them were kind of congratulating themselves on the fact that the vast majority of publishing was, female run. And then essentially, if you had a name that indicated you were a male of European extraction, you didn't even get read. And that's sort of something that we kind of all knew, but to have them kind of go out and say it, it's like, oh, okay. So then there's no merit to this. It doesn't necessarily matter if I have something interesting to say. It's just, does this conform to a political narrative? And so you've mentioned, in all of this that you're self-publishing. And so I'm curious, what is your thought on the process of self-publishing and the creation of culture therein?
I have found it such a beautiful process. I've really enjoyed it. For a while, I was like sending my manuscript around. As you can imagine, like a lot of these, I was very naive. A lot of these mainstream kind of publishers were like, what the fuck is this? There's like a guy jerking off in the bathroom, and there's, like gratuitous use of like various slurs. There's like an Asian character who every time he speaks, like the one character, Josh, like mocks him, in a racist accent. And I'm like, all right, I see where you're coming from. So I realized, okay, I'm going to have to put this thing out by myself. Like, I'm not going to have, someone to design the cover and come up with commercials and all this stuff. So, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I downloaded Photoshop. I learned how to use it. And basically what I realized is I have complete artistic authority over the entire thing. So like I designed the cover. What I did is each chapter starts with like a little picture that I feel in some way associates, with that chapter. And, it's a book that takes place over the course of a school year, a senior's final year at kind of a upper class, classics-based preparatory school. And what I did is indexed old yearbooks for pictures that I felt coincided with those chapters. I put those pictures at the top of each chapter, and I basically had just, again, total control over it. I made some videos narrating chapters with visuals that I added. And I think a book as a physical object is a thing that's a little bit unexplored because writers produce manuscripts, but they're often removed from the aesthetic presentation of the actual physical book. I 100% judge a book by its cover. And I think, if you're someone who's trying to self-publish today, I would say think about that. Like, do you want to hand it off to some graphic designer, or would you rather, maybe take a couple weeks and try to make it something that's totally your own, where every page is, under your control. It's a level of control that really no one has in any creative respect, even a director of a film, to that level.
There's something that, and this is it sounds like a digression, but I'll loop it back in.
Yeah.
That I've noticed in cars, right? There was a conversation, going on about vehicles, right? And how they're sort of different from what they were. I sort of raised the point that, this is kind of like the creeping commodification of everything, right? That this is no longer something that can be said to be designed by someone. It is a product of committee. It is a product of, multiple checks and balances and focus groups. And so, when something passes through that process, on the other end, it's sort of unidentifiable as any one thing. And so I sort of see, literature and books in the same thing, right? Which is that it's very difficult to be an auteur anymore. You have to, have any number of experts, design a cover for you, lay out your type, every one of those things. We know, admittedly, like, those people serve a valuable purpose, but there's something to be said for the fact that, like, if you have ideas that are kind of like dangerous or difficult to express, or expressed in a way that no one has done, you kind of can't go through the well-worn channels.
No, I completely agree. And I think your example of cars is kind of perfect. And more and more, I think something I would criticize, I think a lot of people who champion like Western civilization, but in my view, don't have a good understanding of the actual history of Western civilization. I'll get back to what I mean by that. But I think the real culture war here is not so much left and right as much as you mentioned, this kind of bland sterility versus actual aliveness, right? So like you mentioned with cars, there used to be a focus on individual creativity, sort of unnecessary, wasteful rocket ship parts that they would attach to these 50s cars. Everything now looks like a gray bug, right? And you see this, like we're talking about, with architecture, with cars, with everything. And this kind of obsession with sterility, if you go back historically, it's really an overgrowth of Western civilization, of kind of masculine straight lines and architecture and Apollonian mathematics and right angles. And really, it's funny when people say like the feminization of society. The feminine has always been associated to me with nature and kind of abundance and bacterial, miasmic mossiness, and it's kind of the opposite of this sterile, culture that seems to be spreading everywhere.
And I think the thing as well with cars is that there's been sort of with those kind of a death of kind of one unified stream of pop culture, right? Because and cars are not necessarily individually that important, but they're kind of a sign of the times in the sense that, like, with a little bit of familiarity, you can understand, like, oh, that is something of, the early 30s. That's something of the late 70s. And having a culture at least unified enough to say, like, oh, this is a kind of a unique artistic style of an era requires a culture to be on some level unified. And I think that one of the problems with the internet and culture creation, it has sort of killed true pop culture. And so, one of the parts of MIXTAPE Hyperborea is that there is a musical component to this. Music is kind of woven into the narrative. And one of the things that's been interesting talking to people who are a little bit older is that they have this sense of time and place associated with one song that is shared, right? Oh, that was the song of, 1993. That was the song of, the summer of 1970. Whereas I think that the rise of streaming and kind of digital-based media has sort of killed that shared sense, if you see what I'm getting at.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's really exactly what I was kind of going for here. Is, the novel has a soundtrack, right? So I list on the last page the soundtrack, and I instruct the reader in the beginning of the novel, when you see a song in italics, you play that song in the background lightly while you're reading the text. And part of my goal here was, I'm not a fan of ultra descriptive writing because, like you're mentioning, I want to create this sensory association between what's happening in the text and the song. So I think a lot of bad writing tries to be overly descriptive. And it's because they've read a lot of overly descriptive writing from a time before there was film and before there was media and all these visual images that overpower that. Today, I really think literature, I think about this a lot. What is literature going to be moving forward? I think we can't compete with the visual specificness of cinema, right? But what we can do, for example, like in the book, I mentioned the Pioneer Mall, right? So the boys all go to the Pioneer Mall, they smoke, they kind of stare at all like the fat Puerto Rican people and make fun of them. And I don't describe the mall very much because what I'm hoping, my goal is that you populate that ball with your own memories of whatever ball. So if Jay Burden went to, whatever, the Saginaw Mall of America when he was young, that mall becomes the setting of the chapter, right? Which is something that cinema can't compete with, is this, again, like associative relationship. Um, and then that the song playing in the background becomes associated with this false memory almost that it creates in your head, such that like when you hear the song another time, it brings up again this memory, hopefully of the chapter, that feels almost like something that happened to you but didn't.
Well, and there's something interesting in that, and you see it as well with painting, right? That there's sort of this reactionary desire to go back to the way paintings looked in an era pre-photography. And as soon as the camera became widely available, art shifted from being merely descriptive, right? It became more expressive. And I almost argue that part of that is because of technological advance. And like you've said, it's that literature in the same way has to react to changing technology, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. You see, I think you're exactly right. We need to be thinking about what are the core philosophies, right, of painting, emphasizing beauty, maybe order, maybe nature, right? Whatever it is that you think is important to emphasize, let's not emphasize anymore. But yeah, it doesn't make sense to just say anything that's not photorealism, right? Like you see these accounts like Culture Critic, who just like genuinely comes off as pseudo intellectual because he can't understand a Jackson Pollock painting, right, or a Rothko. And it's like, yeah, we can take pictures now. There's art has to move in some kind of greater direction. That doesn't mean it has to be like a banana peel, attached to the wall, or like Piss Christ, that piece of art where the guy put a cross in a bucket of piss. Like, yes, that's trash and that's garbage, but we do need to be thinking about how art is going to evolve. It's not inherently, liberal or I don't know, like unprincipled, to be moving beyond the photorealism of like the Baroque era. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's something that it's sort of a broader trap, right? Which is the danger of pure reaction, which is, and maybe this is outside it, but you see it in a certain brand of of paganism as well, right? Which is kind of like the low IQ, like Viking LARPer sense, where it's essentially like, well, this organ has become diseased. Like if we can use this analogy, right? Like the patient has lung cancer. Well, so let's just get rid of the concept of lungs at all. And I sort of see that same pattern with kind of more abstracted art, right? Where obviously that has been used for evil, that has been subverted any number of ways, but that was a deliberate decision. It isn't necessarily inherent to the media.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah.
So we've probably had enough time to just discuss generalities. So do you want to kind of jump into your work in particular?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to talk about the book. Yeah, yeah.
All right. So do you want to give us kind of a 60,000 foot overview of your work?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's kind of hard to do a plot summary because I really feel like this book has no plot. I can say that it's about a high school senior. It's about his senior year. It's punctuated with an intermission around winter break. But otherwise, it's very much focused on the kind of mundane aspects of being in a classroom, of dodging class and spending time with your friends, of kind of wasting time in strange liminal spaces and parking lots, and talking about girls and struggling with girls and being jealous when one of your friends is successful with girls. And it's very much influenced, by my own life, but in a way that's not necessarily specific to the narrator himself, in a way that's sometimes specific to tertiary characters. And I tried to make it funny. I tried to think about, to me, like nothing was funnier than school. Nothing. I've seen one review that I love is a guy said, basically, this novel is the feeling of like trying not to laugh in class. And I think that's accurate. And that's kind of what I was going for. And that's about as good as I can do on a plot summary, because I would say nothing plot wise really happens, because that's not how life works. That's not how adolescence works, you know?
Yeah, and that was something that I enjoyed it. We've said before that you and I are sort of the same age, and that memory of trying really hard, not to laugh in class, being with your friends, trying to essentially like keep it together, was something that felt very real. And so I don't mean to say this to kind of limit it, but it was a kind of it had a pleasant atmosphere to it that I think would be relatable to a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And that's kind of what I'm going for is, right, like it's more about, I think of a book sort of like as a room, like it's a room that you decorate a certain way. It's not like a tunnel you walk through. And then when you're in the room, it feels a certain way. And when I came up with this book, it started really more with a feeling. And you go in the room, and then the room makes you reflect on a period in your life to think about things. Again, it's more about what it draws out of you, the reader, than it is about like getting all the details to reach some kind of, like climax in the story.
So I'm curious, that's sort of an interesting approach to this. So who would you consider your main literary influences?
It's interesting. I would not say I have a lot of literary influences that specifically do that. I will mention Sam Pink. I'm a big Sam Pink fan. I think he nails some of that, where it feels autobiographical in the sense that it's sort of so mundane it has to be real. In that sense, like some of the stuff you read by him. I really am a huge fan of Raymond Carver. I think in a similar way, because he creates an atmosphere around largely failing adult relationships and midlife and employment and 70s, 60s America. But it really feels like he's almost stubbornly passive. Like he's refusing to give you an easy answer, or refusing to lecture you about anything, in a way that just leaves you with your own thoughts. But more of my influences, I think, have been film. I think more of my influences have been movies that did that, where they similarly like refuse to give you an answer to something, but create a space for you to draw something out of yourself, and mix with the experience of the art.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. So you've mentioned that you've written before, under your real name. I don't obviously, I'm not asking you to reveal that, but where would you consider this work in kind of your creative journey?
Yeah, so now this is kind of going forward. Everything is definitely going to be under this pseudonym. And I kind of have an idea. The first book was very much about youth and high school and adolescence. The next one I hope to tackle, MIXTAPE HYPERBOREA, right, was like the end of high school, the end of something. I want to now do the beginning of adulthood, right? You finish college and there's just this highway in front of you of decades of adulthood, that you kind of embark on, the age that we are now, and then kind of see where it goes from there. I'm very inspired by Richard Linklater's films, right, where he has Boyhood, for example, that is a movie about being maybe ages 5 to 18, and then he has Everybody Wants Some, which is almost the spiritual successor of the college years, and then Before Sunrise, which is post-college, he's going around Europe in a train, and then he tackles like family, and he almost has each stage of the male experience explored in some way. So I'd like to kind of embark on some kind of series that covers that loosely.
No, that's interesting. That's an interesting concept. So I know that you've said that this is kind of almost incredibly mundane in a realistic way. I don't mean that in a disparaging sense, but how much of this kind of came directly from you and your life, and how much of it is something you picked up from elsewhere?
I would say most of it has some real life resemblance, because my process of kind of how I put this together is either remembering things or writing down strange things that I see. So I'll have like my notes app in my phone, and I'll randomly put out throughout the day when I see something that for some reason I want to keep for later, and it'll just kind of look like I'm texting or something. But a lot of the time, I'm not the narrator. So that's the thing, is that in some of the situations in the book, and it's not all, some of it is inspired or stretched, or, a story somebody else told me or something. But in some of the situations, maybe I'm the Josh character, or I'm the Mickey character, or I'm not even one of those characters. There was three, boys who I saw somewhere, dudes who I saw somewhere. Maybe I was on the outside of it, or I was one of the. It's not literally like a memoir in that sense, but I would say it is heavily inspired.
And so, what was the process of composition for this work? Did it take you, years and years to get through? Is it something you wrote in a fugue? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's kind of, I took a long time putting together what I wanted it to be almost like short stories, where each chapter works by itself. Like if you just pull it out and you read a chapter, it works on its own terms, but they're all loosely related, by being a part of the seniors' school year. So I kind of wrote them, and then wrote about 50 to 60 chapters, and then kind of reduced them down to these 40 chapters that I felt best represented the feeling or the atmosphere I wanted the reader to be in.
That's an interesting way to do it. As someone who is sort of struggled personally in my own work with that editing process, what were the kind of the ideas, the feelings you were looking to kind of refine your output towards?
Yeah, well, I think I heard you talk about this a little bit on your episode where you're talking about Junger. Of we as a generation, I think, even men and women, people of all political allegiances, I think we all have this feeling that something's wrong, and that we are not living the way we're supposed to be living, and that in a sense, this is more my interpretation, that things have become artificial or overly sterile in some way. And I am interested in the right more in its artistic symbols, right? So this idea of Hyperborea is to me like this mythical past stage of greater vitality and belief and adventure and freedom. And that as a symbol is something that I was interested in, right? With the contemporary idea of like a mixtape, of like assembling all these tracks, like a CD you would burn for like a girl in middle school or something. And sorry, say the question again. I got lost here.
Sorry, no, I was just asking you. You said when you kind of edited this down, you were going for a specific set of feelings,
Right.
and
So
motifs.
So the feeling to me was a little bit of that, like this idea of almost like Otessa Moshfegh's short story collection. She titled it "Homesick for Another World." This idea of there being this half-remembered place that was real, but it's harder and harder to remember it. And if you can go back there and you can exist in that world for a while, again, there's no one conclusion I want you to pull out of that, but it'll maybe draw you into something that you've lost, or you need to bring back, or you just want to enjoy the reflection of. So that was, I would say, kind of the feeling that I was trying to create.
Yeah, and there is, and it's hard to say, what is nostalgia, and what is, that feeling of remembering a world that was legitimately better. But I sort of have had that thought for kind of the 2000 and then 2010s.
Mm-hmm.
And on one hand, it's easy to say like, oh, you just remember things better, because you had no cares, right? You were a kid, and maybe that's true. But I feel like enough has been said about, especially the pre 2016. Let's just go ahead and say the pre 2013 world, where things were less politicized from a certain perspective,
Right.
right? Like things were less contentious, and it felt like you weren't necessarily in a world going badly. I think there recently came out an article that said something like 80 some percent of Americans agree with the phrase, the country is going poorly. And regardless of your opinions on that, there does seem to be a sort of kind of general malaise at the moment.
No, I completely agree. I think the interesting thing is that it's a different thing for each person. That's the thing is this isn't like necessarily reductively just saying like, wow, it was so awesome to be in the early 2000s. It's more like if we collect all of the hyperobjects and symbols and music and atmosphere of that time, what will this draw out of you about yourself maybe during that time, or draw out of you about some prior version of yourself or your experience that you need to interact with? Does that sort of make sense? It's less about the world, you know? It is meant to be like a very individual journey, I think, also.
Can you explain that phrase hyperobjects? I don't know if I've heard it before.
Yeah, so I'm stealing that from this review this guy Pill Eater did about the book, where he also interpreted me as like having homosexual feelings for my friend, which is not true. Unbelievable review, but I'm not gay, definitely. Um, and he uses this term hyperobjects to basically describe like all the early 2000s objects that appear in the book, right? So like mixtapes rather than Spotify playlists, or a projector in the classroom rather than like a TV, or like this video camera that pops up when they're at the mall, and the gypsy of Hyperborea is filming them, in the comedy show, versus everyone just pulling out their iPhones, right, and filming. So, all these different objects that you would associate with the prior time.
Okay, that makes sense. And I
Yeah.
think that is something as well that has sort of been kind of changed by the advent of digital technology. Because one of the advantages of schools, right, is schools never have enough money. So there's sort of a technological lag in the sense that, even well into the era of the smartphone, I remember things like, physical overhead projectors, right, where the teacher, writes out on a piece of cellophane, with a dry erase marker, instead of a smart board or something like that. And I think that as those things go away, those objects kind of become more powerful by their absence, if you see what I'm getting at.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's part of what I was going for. Yeah.
Well, great. So I'm curious, what do you think your kind of next steps are? I know you've said you want to keep writing about kind of like the different stages in a man's life. And are you going to wait until you kind of personally reach those stages, or are you going to kind of write looking forward?
I have the idea for what I'm going for next, less the specifics and more the philosophical, again, like zone or room I want to build here. I was talking a little bit earlier about, I see the real culture war as sterilization versus life, right? I think that's what's really going on. And I have just been blown away by Camille Paglia's work. I've been reading so much of it. I went back after reading her work to read Nietzsche and Freud and a lot of the people she was inspired by. And what she totally revolutionized for me is seeing the world, like I was mentioning earlier, through this lens of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. That there is the Apollonian, which represents, well, there's first the Dionysian, you should start with that, which represents essentially femininity, the earth, procreative nature. Like the root of the Latin word for nature literally means birth, and all ancient cultures associated femininity with birth and generation. And, you think about like a Greek god like Gaia in Greek mythology, right? That feminine is associated with this flowering and abundance, right? And that the masculine really is a revolt against that. That you can essentially understand Western civilization and I don't mean this in a bad way, as man's revulsion from the sort of, again, like murky, soupy, violent, bloody world of nature to straight lines and architecture and music theory and mathematics. And as she explains, all these Apollonian ideals. So that contrast is very interesting to me. I want to do something which essentially is about the post college life of a few guys, maybe a female character, that is all about that contrast, the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Well, I highly caution you against interacting with women in any way, but I will say I think that distinction is an interesting one. You know, it's been years since I've gone into Nietzsche, but that idea is someone that I've kind of encountered most recently in Evola, right? The idea of kind of like the lunar feminine and the masculine and the solar. And it is a kind of a very core insight in that. And I think it's one of the things, again, like we said, that it becomes almost impossible to discuss in modernity, in the sense that when you've imbibed egalitarianism to such a degree that there can be no difference between men and women, you sort of lose all of the interesting bits about both, right? When you're kind of committed to this inversion, and inversion can be interesting. It can be kind of a tool that you use for emphasis. But the problem is when that becomes everything, when the exception becomes the rule, it becomes incredibly uninteresting. And I think that, even writers who were more feminist, but from kind of a previous era, understood the feminine in a more interesting way. And so writers like Ursula K. Le Guin understood how to make a character who was female identifiably and still interesting. And I think that is another area, and kind of playing on that, interaction between the sexes, that is kind of impossible to address honestly and interestingly.
No, totally. And I think the ironic part is a lot of it, I think, is very flattering to women and kind of humorously disparaging of men. Interpretations like the one that essentially when a man is growing up and he looks down at his penis, he sees an objective thing, like this rod that points out or points toward the sky. And that then he develops this belief and this need for objectivity in everything, that everything there must be truth, there must be some way in which I am a divine being removed from this like murky, again, violent, bloody earth. Whereas women maybe have more of an understanding of ambiguity because they do not see themselves in that objective sense. They have more of an understanding of gray areas. They feel more at home in the world because they're tied to the cycles of the earth. It sometimes makes me envious, in a way. I think about, and it was an interesting interpretation Paglia has of the Mona Lisa, which I always kind of dismissed and just thought, what's the big deal? Some bitch in a painting. Where she says, what the Mona Lisa is the sort of earth mother. It's sort of the divine, like this feminine mother smirking at her many sons who are running around the world, building towers and rockets and computer systems and video games and coming up with religions. And she's just kind of at peace. She's like leaning back in cycle with the world, in a way that women are and men just maybe inherently aren't, right? So I totally agree. I think these dichotomies bring a lot of beauty to the world and a lot of, and essentially this is what Western civilization has always been about, is exploring this ambiguity between these two forces.
Well, and one of the things that is sort of frustrating in this, right, is the active and passive role, like you've mentioned, that traditionally the way narratives were structured is that men acted upon female characters, right, and this has been identified as the feminists as objectifying the women, like the women are kind of passive receivers of male action and attention. But the problem is it's sort of true, right? And when you go away from that, and obviously I don't want to just endlessly turn back to pop culture, but it's a useful tonic in this, right? That, I think of something like the last television show I think I watched was the Amazon reboot, Rings of Power. And by watched, I mean, I watched 1.5 episodes and then decided to never watch TV again. And in that, right, you have this kind of like female character in name only, and Tolkien understood this much better. He could have female characters who were kind of realistic and true to life. But when that becomes kind of subsumed to ideology, you essentially have a male and female vying for that role. And because of ideology, the man must by default lose. And so then it's like, well, okay, like we have this race of better than men who look like women. And it's just thoroughly uninteresting, I guess. I don't know.
It's totally uninteresting. Yeah. And this is why I would urge people who are interested in Western civilization to try to see it more through that lens and to research it. And that's what I think is kind of the funny outcome, is that essentially the male Apollonian drive that has, created the incredible ambition of Western civilization, but also likes to categorize everything, right, into these little boxes of genus and species and male and female, right? Just like the writers of these shows, right, who need to, categorize everything. What that is really is the Apollonian spirit kind of overgrowing and going crazy and going way too close to the sun so that it incinerates itself. And now we have this obsession with category and identity and gender in a way that is very Western, right? It's very much an expansion of the same Western drive, right? In a very ironic way, which I find interesting. When people talk about, right, we need this return to like the pagan vitality, what they're really saying, and I'm being a little cheeky here, but what they're really saying is we need a return to a more feminine world. We need a return to a more natural, procreative, you know what I mean? Like unartificial categorized world.
So this is the kind of core truth of the Icarus myth, right? Is that like the very thing that, kind of brings you high ends up kind of destroying you, right? Like that's behind the Greek idea of hamartia, the tragic flaw. And I do think that there's something in that, right? And that the power of classification, right? And you see this in Genesis, right? That man exerts his dominion over nature by naming it, right? And to name something is to classify and systematize it. That is sort of our charge given to us by God. But at the same time, and this is why in many systems, right, the masculine, feminine, the chaos and order are kind of seen as a yin and yang. Two halves of the same circle kind of counterbalancing each other. That if you lean too hard into this kind of like systematizing, this kind of like structure, you ossify, right? You turn to bone. You can't move and flex. And I think that people incorrectly see, kind of like the excess feminine, the toxic feminine in some ways in the current regime, and say, all right, well then the correct answer is more structure. And from a certain perspective, that's probably true. But on the other end, it's like we have so much structure grown up around around narrative, around the way the economy works, that it's like, well, in order to do anything different whatsoever, it sort of has to be broken. There needs to be chaos for there to be kind of a new order on the other side. And I guess that is kind of like the cyclical nature of human affairs.
It's an excellent point. And I think, on the really micro level, like I was in Europe this summer, and what you're talking about, where the funny thing about Europe is there is so much less structure. If you go to restaurants and stores and businesses, and there's so much like cutting corners and don't worry about it, and I don't need a receipt, and yeah, we just, like health code violations and like little tit for tat, semi-corrupt arrangements between businesses. And it's so much more fluid and dynamic. And then you come back to America and everything is so legal and structured. And these boundaries, these like frames are so hard around everything. I think that's what that reminded me of a little bit.
And that sort of goes back to our brief digression about cars, right? That in a way, we sort of min-maxed and optimized our way out of, any sort of human expression, right? That's like, oh, well, we found out the most efficient shape for a car, and it's essentially the shape of a 2023 Honda CR-V. And so essentially everything will approach that point. And so when you sort of optimize, when you've created, a 2 or 3 variable equation and just have to solve, you kind of lose any kind of variability. Everything becomes the same. And because of the legislative or the legal atmosphere in the U.S., where there is this immense amount of safetyism, which, to kind of go back to that masculine feminine, is a sort of feminine version of of structure. The like, don't play with that, you'll hurt yourself. It's sort of created this incredibly oppressive atmosphere, especially for young people, right? For people like you and I who want to try things and do things that probably aren't particularly good for you. So anyway, maybe that's a little bit rambly, but I see what I'm getting at.
I think that's exactly what the book's about. So like, for example, the chapter 6, the sleepover, right, is this chapter where it flashes back within a flashback, right? It goes back to middle school, and the boys are having their first sleepover. And they sneak out. They hop over the fence, and they're going to pool all their money, and they're going to go to Denny's at 2 a.m. Like, that's the big adventure. And the parents don't know about it. And there's this violent interaction that happens that did happen to a buddy of mine, shout out him, where he attacked a bunch of random people outside of a gas station because they stole his skateboard. And it was incredibly dangerous, and there were no adults around. And it was completely invigorating. It was completely defining for our identities at the time, to be in this really dangerous situation. And something worse could have happened. The situation could have gone worse than it did, which is also why it was so invigorating. And this is what I think is, we're talking about this kind of over-sterilization, the safetyism. What people want, I feel, is authenticity. Is they want to engage not only in life but in art with things that are real, and things that bring up, again, that aliveness. And much of that spirit is also what I was trying to capture, with the book.
No, definitely. And that's what I found very appealing in your work. So Adam, we're coming up on time. I've got to be up a little bit earlier than normal, so we're gonna have to wrap things up. But if people want to find you, maybe want to find your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
You can find it on Twitter. You can find, if you go on Twitter, you'll find my page. You can find a link to the book on Amazon there. Buy the freaking book. Come on, everybody, buy the book. Also, just real quick, I would love to shout out, just if you're interested in kind of what I feel is this very interesting, energetic, emerging, alternative or dissident art scene, the Tookies Mag podcast, the Sidebar podcast, is doing literature reviews of this type of fiction. They've done Nutcracker, an excellent book by Dan Baltic. They've explored the work of A.R.X. Hahn. So go check them out. And yeah, those are just a couple of my recommendations if you're interested in kind of exploring non-mainstream literature, non-mainstream podcasting that's covering this whole cultural sphere. And I think give it a few years and this whole thing is going to start to escalate.
No, definitely. And that's why I've really been enjoying talking to, the guys who create things. I've had T.R. Hudson on a few times. I've had Dan Baltic on, and I intend to keep doing that because obviously I have a political bent. I'm interested in those sort of things, but you can only talk about, the kind of current thing. You can only talk about, cultural, just decay so much. And if you don't ever create anything, if you don't have anything active to say, it just gets very, very blackpilling and depressing. And aside from that, these are not ideas you find in the bestsellers section, right? Like, there's interesting things being done. So if nothing else, that's a pretty good reason to check out Adam's book. I read it. I enjoyed it. I would have paid for it, but he gave it to me for free. So anyway, if you want to support my show, you can do that in any number of ways. One of the best ones is to head over to my sponsor, Axios. It's a fitness and coaching solution. I know the owner. I know JD. He's a solid guy. JD works with me. He works with Pete Quinones. And if you want to get in good shape, it's a good way to do it. You can join a online fitness community. You do the same workout that I do and see if I'm stronger than you, in which case I don't need to take your opinion seriously on anything. Or if you're stronger than me, in which case you're probably on steroids. One of the other ways you can support the show is to buy a sticker. I made a sticker for the cheapest price I possibly could. If you want to stick it somewhere in the real world and send me a photo, that'd be pretty cool. And if you want to find the show, it's available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And again, Adam, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me. Had a blast.
I do. And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. Light can't last forever. Good night.